Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to AMP's 14th educational webinar titled Administrative Detention, the Case of Hisham Abu Hawash. My name is Tariq Khalid, and I'm the education coordinator with the American Muslims for Palestine. I'm honored to have with us a powerhouse panel, which I will introduce shortly, to discuss this very important topic of Israel's administrative detention regime. I want to briefly lay out the meaning of administrative detention so we can understand the gravity of this topic, and our panel will eventually expand on it. Basically, it's this: if you're administratively detained, you are detained without legal proceedings, and the evidence used against you is secret and classified and not revealed to the detainee nor the attorney representing him. And the hearings are closed to the public and to the family. Basically, you're not charged, you're not tried, nor convicted, and you have no idea when you'll be released. Some of these detainees are under the age of 18, and the common question would be, well, don't the courts get involved and stop this draconian process and reverse it? No, unfortunately not. The Israeli court system is integral to that process. Judges, for the most part, confirm administrative detention orders and always accept the prosecution's demand that the evidence remain confidential for, quote, reasons of national security, when in fact Israel employs its administrative detention regime as a punitive as opposed to a preventative measure. So given the extreme nature of Israeli administrative detentions and its illegal application, it would seem likely that the will of the Palestinian people would be broken and their resistance crushed. But that's not the case at all. Hisham Abu Hawash is but one example, and there are many more like him, either currently or formerly in administrative detention, languishing in Israeli prisons, who defy Israeli settler colonialism, especially through hunger striking. So with that, I want to introduce our panel to expand on this concept of administrative detentions and how it applies, and we can have a fruitful discussion here. We had three panelists, one of whom was not able to log on yet, but hopefully pretty soon. Hopefully there's no internet issues or technical difficulties, but inshallah we'll have Mu'ath on as well. But right now we have Yamna Patel, who is the Palestine News Director at Mondoweiss, a US-based organization focused on providing news and analysis unavailable through the mainstream media regarding the struggle for Palestinian human rights. Yamna has been reporting in Palestine for 6 years on stories that affect the everyday lives of Palestinians under occupation. We're also glad to be joined by Shada Hamad, who is a Palestinian journalist who currently works for Middle East Eye, where she focuses on the coverage of political and social issues in the occupied West Bank. She also specializes in the coverage of Palestinian detainees in Israeli prisons. She's currently pursuing a master's in modern Arabic studies at Birzeit University. We have here as well, for the benefit of our audience, Sikandar Rahman, who will be translating for Shada Hamad. He's a freelance translator of Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. He's based in New York City. He completed his master's in international studies and diplomacy from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, where he wrote his dissertation, The Indian Occupation of Kashmir, Another Palestine. And more recently, he served as a research associate at a due diligence company conducting open source research of companies and individuals globally in Arabic, Urdu, and Persian. And if Mu'ath logs in anytime soon, he is a former Palestinian detainee, and I wanted him to share his experience with us as well. But with that said, let's begin with our wonderful panel. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Sikandar, for translating for our sister Shada. So the basic question is this: I want you to shed light on Israel's administrative detention policy, and specifically this case of Hisham Abu Hawash. We understand he was on a hunger strike for 141 days. We understand what he had to actually suffer, what he endured up until Israel conceding his administrative detention and hopefully releasing him in February. So I want you both to speak on this. Yamna, we'll start with you, and then we'll move on to Shada. Please.
Thank you for having me. I guess I can start off by giving a little bit more background about Hisham's case. He was arrested by Israeli forces from his home in the town of Dura in the southern occupied West Bank in the Hebron district at the end of October 2020. And like most Palestinians who are arrested by Israel, his home was raided in the middle of the night, and he was dragged out by Israeli soldiers, in front of his wife and his children. For the first few days, I spoke to Hisham's family and interviewed them while he was on hunger strike. They said for the first few days they didn't actually know where he was until around 5-6 days after his detention. He was put under administrative detention, and he was given an order of 6 months at first. And so, as you mentioned, administrative detentions are renewable, so they can continue indefinitely, and they're usually renewed between a period of 3 to 6 months. And so he got that first administrative detention order. After the 6 months were up, it was renewed for another time. And in the meantime, his lawyers were attempting to appeal his case through the Israeli Supreme Court. And it actually turned out that in August 2021, the Israeli Supreme Court essentially refused to hear his appeal, with the judge saying that they wouldn't open his file in the Supreme Court until he had served at least 2 years under administrative detention. And so it was after that that Hisham decided to embark on his hunger strike, basically in protest of the injustice of his arrest. And this was actually the fourth time, I believe, that Hisham was imprisoned by the Israeli occupation. His family told us that prior to this administrative detention, he had spent 8 years in Israeli prisons during 3 different prison stints. 2 of those were also administrative detention orders. So if you've been put in administrative detention once and you're released after months, years, it doesn't mean that that's it. Many of the prisoners who are currently under administrative detention or who have been at some point in their lives have cases similar to that of Hisham, where they've been imprisoned for over a long period of time, for years throughout the course of their lives, under different administrative detention orders. And as you mentioned, they're never actually formally charged. They never have a trial, and they're never actually told why they're being imprisoned, which is why hunger striking, in the case of Hisham and several other prisoners, is a common tactic of resistance used by Palestinian administrative detainees, essentially to attain their freedom. So that's a little bit of background about Hisham's case. And it's also important to know, as you mentioned at the beginning, Tariq, is that the role that the courts play in upholding these administrative detention orders, as was in the case of Hisham, the Israeli Supreme Court refused to hear his appeal until he was, in administrative detention for 2 years. So that just shows the roles that the Israeli courts, not only the military courts in the occupied West Bank, but also the Supreme Court and the district and civil courts in Israel as well, serve to hold up these policies that are used to imprison Palestinians en masse.
No, thank you. Thank you for that background. That's actually a good segue for just giving us the right context here for Hisham's case, and to show that it's not really dissimilar to a lot of cases prior and that are current as well. Shada, same question to you, and Sakandar will translate after you finish. تفضلي شدا.
مرحبا، يعطيكم العافية. يعني أنا بدي أحكي كمان عن موضوع الاعتقال الإداري بشكل عام وتصاعد الاعتقال الإداري بالفترة الأخيرة. يعني يعني حالة هشام أبو هواش كانت جزء من عدد كبير من حالات الاعتقال الإداري. العام الماضي كان 1995 أمر اعتقال إداري صدر عن سلطات الاستعمار الصهيوني أو سلطات الاستعمار الإسرائيلية تجاه الأسرى الفلسطينيين. معظمهم أسرى قضوا سنوات سابقة في السجون، معظم السنوات اللي قضوها كمان كان تحت أمر الاعتقال الإداري. حسب البيان المشترك لمؤسسات الأسرة وحقوق الإنسان بفلسطين عن الإحصائية المتعلقة بالأسرة لعام 2021، كان في تأكيد لارتفاع كبير بعدد حالات الاعتقال، وخاصة الاعتقال الإداري. اليوم في عنا 500 أسير فلسطيني في السجون الإسرائيلية معتقلين تحت بند الاعتقال الإداري، معظمهم اليوم بخوضوا خطوة احتجاجية جماعية متمثلة برفض التعامل مع المحاكم الإسرائيلية، رفض الخضوع للمحاكم الإسرائيلية، وذلك لأن في إيمان لدى الأسير الفلسطيني بتواطؤ القضاء الإسرائيلي مع الأجهزة الأمنية الإسرائيلية يعني فرض أوامر الاعتقال الإداري على الأسرى. اليوم في عنا خطوة جماعية بيكون فيها 500 أسير، بتتضمن مقاطعة المحاكم الإسرائيلية، وهذا بتطلب يعني مساندة دولية كبيرة واستغلال هاي الحادثة لوقف الاعتقال الإداري والضغط على السلطات الإسرائيلية لوقف الاعتقال الإداري. يعني لازم إحنا كمان نعرف يعني بمثل هذه الجلسة شو يعني الاعتقال الإداري، واللي هو يعني بند ما بنشوفه يطبق بأي دولة. في عنا حالة استثنائية بفلسطين بما أنها هي الدولة الوحيدة تقريبا الخاضعة اللي ما زالت خاضعة للاستعمار، يمارس ضدها سياسات استعمارية مختلفة بتأثر على مجمل مناحي الحياة الفلسطينية، من بينها الاعتقال الإداري اللي بيتم تنفيذه في الأراضي الفلسطينية من عام 1945، وهو إجراء تم يعني أخذ من الانتداب البريطاني، واللي كمان حاول كان يفهم أن الطعام هو ومن بداية الاعتقال الإداري ومن بداية كمان فتح السجون الإسرائيلية في الأراضي الفلسطينية، كان الإضراب عن الطعام هو الوسيلة الوحيدة أمام الفلسطينيين للتصدي لسياسات الاحتلال وممارسات تجاههم. الاعتقال الإداري دائما يواجه عملية الإضراب عن الطعام، سواء عمليات الإضراب عن الطعام الفردية أو الجماعية. العام الماضي عام 2021 كان في تصاعد كبير بعدد اللي أضربوا عن الطعام من الأسرى المعتقلين الإداريين، بلغ عددهم تقريبا 60 أسير أضربوا عن الطعام خاضوا الإضرابات الفردية، وهذا عدد كثير كبير. وهذا يعني بيعكس يعني خطورة الاعتقال الإداري واتساعه وتصاعده بالفترة الأخيرة وخاصة العام الماضي. وكمان ما بننسى كمان كان في يعني خطوة إضراب عن الطعام جماعية قادتها حركة الجهاد الإسلامي ضد الممارسات القمعية اللي تم ممارستها بعد عملية نفق الحرية وهروب الأسرى 6 من سجن جلبوع. وكمان يعني كل هاي المستجدات بالاعتقال الإداري وتصاعد الأعداد اللي بيخضعوا للاعتقال الإداري واستمرار رفض الأسرى لبدء الاعتقال الإداري، كان في هناك كمان تحولات من قبل أجهزة الاحتلال المختلفة، القضاء والأجهزة الأمنية والعسكرية خلال عمليات الإضراب عن الطعام. لاحظنا بشكل كبير الإهمال المتعمد للأسرى المضربين عن الطعام، استمرار احتجازهن بظروف سيئة، كمان عدم نقلهن للمشافي إلا بعد وقت طويل، تعمد إيصالهن لمرحلة حرجة وخطيرة، وهو الإشي اللي صار كمان مع هشام أبو هواش اليوم لما وصل 141 يوم على إضراب عن الطعام. وكمان لازم كمان نشير أن هشام اليوم هو مصاب بفيروس كورونا، هو من يومين تم اكتشاف إصابته بفيروس كورونا بسبب تم نقل الفيروس إلى خلال تواجده بالمستشفى أساف هوروفيل الإسرائيلي. وهذا كمان بشير يعني قديش في بتم توفير بيئة صحية وطبية للأسرى، وخاصة الأسرى اللي بيخوضوا الإضراب عن الطعام واللي بيفقدوا كثير من صحتهم ويعني ومن يعني وما في أي ظروف صحية بيكونوا فيها. وكل هاي الإجراءات اللي بتقوم فيها السلطات الإسرائيلية، هي نقطة أخيرة، بتيجي ضمن يعني إجراءات تنكيلية متصاعدة وكمان انتقامية اتجاه الأسرى الفلسطينيين، وخاصة الأسرى اللي بيعبروا عن رفضهم للاعتقال الإداري، وهدفها بشكل أساسي كسر الإضراب عن الطعام ومنع الأسرى الفلسطينيين من استخدام هاي الوسيلة الوحيدة في التصدي لكل السياسات والممارسات اللي بيتم فرضها عليهم داخل السجون الإسرائيلية. شكرا.
Thank you so much, Shada. Skandar, if you will, please provide the translation for our audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Shukran, Shada. The administrative detention and the continuous extension that the Palestinian prisoner Hisham Abu Hawash was subjected to was one of the 1,595 administrative detention orders issued by the Israeli / Zionist colonial authorities towards the Palestinian prisoners, most of whom were former prisoners who spent years in Israeli prisons. According to statements of prisoners and human rights associations and institutions in Palestine, issued at the beginning of this year, 2022, last year, 2021, witnessed an increase in the number of detainees and prisoners who faced colonial policies, most notably the policy of administrative detention, which is often without charge, no trial. Today, there are about 500 prisoners held under administrative detention in the Israeli occupation prisons, and all of them have been engaged in a mass protest for around 15 days. And these being represented by the boycott of Israeli courts in rejection of the policy of administrative detention. And these particularly important and effective steps, but its continuity and success requires internal popular support and, most importantly, international support from human rights institutions and other nations and other peoples. Israeli military laws relating to administrative detention orders go back to the emergency law enacted by the British Mandate of 1945. And the Israeli military command relies on the majority of administrative detention cases on these secret materials. The military courts of the occupation constitute the main tool in consolidating the policy of administrative detention by violating the guarantees of fair courts, including the refusal to inform the detainee and his or her lawyer of the charges against them. The hunger strike is the only means carried out by these prisoners detained under the administrative clause that expresses their rejection of this arrest and demanding their release. Last year, the number of Palestinian prisoners who participated in the individual hunger strike against administrative detention reached about 60 prisoners. In addition to the collective strike led by the prisoners of the Islamic Jihad movement, in rejection of a series of abusive measures imposed by the prison administration against them after the Freedom Tunnel operation carried out by 6 prisoners who managed to escape from the Israeli Gilboa prison. It should be noted that Hisham Abu Hawash was infected by COVID-19 2 days ago as a result of being transferred to one of the Israeli hospitals where he receives treatment if he still suffers from health complications due to the 141-day hunger strike. His presence inside the Israeli Asif Harofe hospital is considered a continuation of his detention, as according to the latest agreement that ending his strike resulted in his release on February 26th. So the Israeli Prisons Administration also follows a set of abusive retaliatory measures against the striking prisoners. So in an attempt to break the strike step, most notably denying them family visits, obstructing lawyers' communication with them, the frequent transfers from one prison to another, isolating them in cells completely unfit for human life, and harassment by jailers around the clock. So lastly, the occupation authority deliberately delayed responding to the demands of these striking prisoners by bringing them to dangerous health conditions, which would be difficult for the prisoner to face later and affect their life.
Thank you so much for that, Sikandar, and thank you to Yamna and Shada for giving us just that overall context of what we're actually dealing with here. I want to focus on Was I on mute the whole time? I was on mute, wasn't I? Okay. Well, I thanked you, and then I thanked our panel for giving us that very, very important context that you both laid out. Thank you so much. I want to focus on one particular aspect here, and that is the international response, the international outcry to Hisham's case, and if in any way that played a huge role in the Israeli concession here into not furthering his administrative detention. But it seems as though this policy has been used for decades and decades, and as Shada pointed out as well, that these derive from the 1945 British emergency regulations. And so it's not a new phenomenon. It's not a new tool that Israel employs for collective punishment and punitive purposes. So has this international response played a role in this, and what can we do actually to use the energy of the international community to help bring an end to this administrative detention regime, which is just one element of Israel's overarching settler-colonial project, but it's a very significant one, considering the extreme measure that it actually is. Yamna, we'll start with you, and then we'll go with to Shada.
Sure. I think in response to your question, it's important to differentiate between sort of the global civilian population and the global sort of civilian community and the international community when it comes to international agencies and bodies of government and leaders, because they've played very different roles when it comes to any of Israel's, violations in Palestine, and specifically the case of Hisham Abu Hawash. So I think, in part, yes, the international response of people globally, the outcry we saw on social media, lots of media attention, then as a result was brought to his case, and I do think that played a role in eventually the Israelis, agreeing to a deal to release him at the end of February. I mean, I was there at the Abu Hawash's family homes, right when he was on his 140th day of hunger strike, I believe it was. And, there were lots of people from the community that were coming and, just sort of standing in solidarity with the family. And I was sitting with two of Hisham's brothers, and, they were just constantly receiving phone calls from different media outlets. And this had came after more than 140 days of Hisham's brother, Ahmad, who works for the Palestinian Center of Human Rights. He had been lobbying day in and day out, night after night, appealing to international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and different bodies like the EU, et cetera, trying to appeal to these groups to put international pressure on Israel to release his brother so he could end his strike. And most of his appeals, as he told me, most of his appeals to these international agencies and bodies proved to be futile. He received little to no response from these bodies that are, supposed to be upholding international human rights laws across the globe. He received very little to no response when it came to his brother's case, which is, of course, disheartening for the family, but also not completely unexpected, because radio silence from the international community and places that are supposed to be upholding the laws and international justice are often silent when it comes to Israeli violations against Palestinians. So that's sort of my two-part answer into the role that the international community played. And as for what we could do, or what the people who, want to help, or people who want to raise awareness, and people who are supporting the Palestinian cause could do, I spoke today to one of Hisham's brothers to sort of check in on his situation, because as Shada mentioned, he recently tested positive for COVID. And the family were very adamant that, this fight isn't over. He ended his hunger strike, and he was agreed to be released at the end of February. But as Shada mentioned again, he still very much is under detention in an Israeli hospital. the family is very worried about his health condition. You know, after more than 140 days on hunger strike, it took an extreme toll on his body. His muscles had begun to atrophy. It severely affected a lot of his organs, and you know, he's missing a lot of essential vitamins and enzymes and nutrients in his body. And now with COVID, his family is worried that his health situation could deteriorate further. And his brother told me that, you know, we still need people to make noise about Hisham's case, because you know, all that noise did help in him again eventually getting to reach an agreement to end his strike. But he's still in detention. He's still under threat now with this now COVID diagnosis. And so the family said, you know, the fight is not over. They're demanding that he be transferred to a Palestinian hospital in the West Bank because they say he's not receiving proper care, and there's a lot of medical negligence going on where he is now in the Israeli hospital. So the family is asking people who made noise about his case before to continue making noise and to continue putting pressure on their respective governments and leaders to hold Israel accountable, and to hopefully, you know, get Hisham transferred to a hospital in the West Bank.
Okay. شاذة، السؤال هو: هل يمكنك التحدث عن انتهاك القانون الدولي يتم استخدامه بشكل تمييزي، والذي تستخدمه إسرائيل تحت عباءة الأمن كذريعة لمعاقبة الناشطين السياسيين؟ والجزء الثاني هو إنه شو فينا نعمل نحن يلي عايشين برا، وشو كان ردة فعل المجتمع الدولي؟
يعني بدايةً الاعتقال الإداري هو مخالف للقوانين، له القوانين الدولية، للعديد من القوانين الدولية اللي بتحفظ كرامة الإنسان، وخاصة الإنسان اللي يعني يخضع اللي بحالة حرب، واللي بيخضع للاستعمار. يعني العهد الدولي الخاص بالحقوق المدنية والسياسية، يعني ضمن على الأقل محاكمة عادلة للأسير، زي ما بتنص المادة رقم 9 أن لا يجوز القبض على أحد أو اعتقاله تعسفيا، لا يجوز حرمان أحد من حريته إلا لأسباب ينص عليها القانون وطبقا للإجراء المقرر فيه. اللي بيصير بحالة الاعتقال الإداري، المخابرات الإسرائيلية هي اللي بتضغط على القضاء الإسرائيلي لإصدار قرار بالاعتقال الإداري. ما في بيكون توجيه أي تهمة، ما بيكون في أي لائحة اتهام. الأسير الفلسطيني بالعادة ما بيخضع للمحاكمة، ما بيكون في جلسة محاكمة، ما بيكون في قاضي ومحامي وأسير. فبالتالي الأسير بيكون بالسجن لما يتسلم قرار بالاعتقال الإداري أو قرار بتمديد اعتقاله تحت البند الإداري. فبالتالي إحنا بنشوف هان في انتهاك كثير واضح وخطير بحقوق الإنسان اللي بتمارسها السلطات الإسرائيلية بأداة الاعتقال الإداري، واللي بيستوجب تدخل يعني دولي، وما زال التدخل الدولي ما زال يعني متأخر جدا إلى اليوم. كمان يعني النقطة كمان اللي بدي أأكد عليها أن المحاكم الاعتقال الإداري تحديدًا مش علنية، ما بتكون علنية، وهذا الإشي كمان بيخالف العهد الدولي الخاص بالحقوق المدنية والسياسية. بيمنع، ما بيكون الأسير موجود، ما بيكون المحامي موجود زي ما حكيت، عائلة الأسير ما بتكون موجودة، الإعلام كمان ما بيكون موجود في جلسات اللي بتقرر الاعتقال الإداري. وكذلك يعني إحنا بنعرف كمان السلطات الإسرائيلية بتمنع الإعلام من التواجد في معظم جلسات المحاكمة للأسرى، اللي بيصدر خلال هاي الجلسات يعني أحكام بالسجن تجاه الأسرى، إلا بحالات نادرة زي الأحكام المؤبدة. أحيانا بيكون في تواجد لإعلام دولي أو إعلام إسرائيلي. اليوم إحنا المطلوب من إحنا يعني طول الوقت التعامل مع الاعتقال الإداري وقضية الاعتقال الإداري، مع إنها قضية قديمة في فلسطين من عام 1945 زي ما حكيت، ولكن التعامل مع الاعتقال الإداري هو تعامل موسمي. إحنا بس يكون عندنا إضراب عن الطعام، بيكون في تعامل دولي وشعبي وتدخل للمؤسسات الحقوقية، بيطلع لنا صوت رافض للاعتقال الإداري. وهذا التعامل الموسمي ما بفيد وما صار إلى نتيجة. لحديت هسه ما بنلمس إلى نتيجة. يعني إحنا اليوم بحاجة للمراقمة على الفعل الاحتجاجي الرافض للاعتقال الإداري. يعني بدنا المطلوب اليوم حراك جدي على المستوى الحقوقي، المؤسسات الحقوقية بإجبار إسرائيل الالتزام بالمؤسسات يعني بالمعاهدات الدولية اللي بتضمن حقوقنا كفلسطينيين. من جهة ثانية، واللي هو الموضوع كمان اللي ما بنقدر نستثنيه وننساه، ضرورة الضغط، ضرورة مقاطعة إسرائيل على المستوى السياسي والاقتصادي والثقافي من قبل الحكومات والشعوب والمؤسسات المختلفة لفرض حصار على إسرائيل وإجبارها على يعني عدم انتهاك وعدم الاستمرار بانتهاك حقوقنا كفلسطينيين. يعني حتى موضوع مقاطعة إسرائيل هو أصبح قضية موسمية، وهذا الشيء قاعدين اليوم بنلمس مدى ضرره وانعكاسه الخطير على القضية الفلسطينية بشكل عام، وعلى قضية الاعتقال الإداري بشكل خاص. فإحنا اليوم المطلوب يعني عدم التعامل بموسمية مع القضايا الفلسطينية المختلفة اللي إحنا قاعدين بنعيشها بشكل يومي، وخاصة قضية الاعتقال الإداري. وكمان نقطة أخيرة بحب أحكيها، أن يعني اليوم الشعب الفلسطيني بيعيش بحالة كبيرة من القمع من قبل إسرائيل بالسياسات المختلفة. يعني اللي إحنا السياسات المختلفة والممارسات اللي بنعيشها يوميا، من اعتقال، من اقتحامات، من مصادرة للحريات، من هدم للمنازل، من قتل للفلسطينيين. ومن جهة ثانية كمان السلطة الفلسطينية بتضيق على الحريات بشكل كبير. فاليوم الشعب الفلسطيني محاصر بشكل كبير، هو غير قادر على الحراك الشعبي زي ما كان سابقا، وهو الأمر اللي بتطلب اليوم مساندة دولية لمساندة الشعب الفلسطيني للخروج من هاي الضائقة والحصار اللي مفروض عليه اليوم، ومن مصادرة حقوقه على يعني مختلف المستويات.
شكرا شذا. Administrative detention, as practiced by the Israeli colonial authorities against Palestinians, is a complete violation of international law, and not just one, but several. In particular, Article 9 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states, no one may be arbitrarily arrested or detained, and that no one may be deprived of his or her liberty except for reasons stipulated by law in accordance with the procedure established therein. The State of Israel frequently is involved in human rights violations in addition. And on the other hand, the administrative detention review sessions to take place in non-public sessions. So that means the public or family members are not allowed to attend them. So only the lawyer, the detainee, the judge, the military prosecutor, and sometimes intelligence representatives from Israel are in attendance, which constitutes a deprivation of the detainee's right to a public trial. In addition, this violates Article 14 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees the right to a public trial as an essential element of a fair trial. The law shall be that the trial shall be conducted orally and in public, and the information concerning the time and place of the trial shall be made public by the court of whatever kind. So as we all know, this is a very old cause dating back to the beginning of the Nakba. So helping prisoners detained under the administrative cause requires serious international intervention by human rights organizations, institutions, and other governments to put pressure on these Israeli courts to carry out fair trial procedures, which will directly result in the cessation of administrative detention. In addition, nations and their citizens and their institutions are obliged to abide by the fundamental boycott of Israel politically, economically, and culturally. This is a necessary and important tool to which the world can impose a siege upon Israel and force it to abide by international law, but also not to violate the rights of Palestinians. And using this as a means to stop the administrative detention, the unjust colonial policies and procedures imposed by the Israeli and the unjust colonial policies and procedures imposed by the Israeli authorities. So lastly, we need to put serious pressure from institutions across the globe in solidarity with Palestinians, in solidarity with the human rights of Palestinians. The seasonal dealing with the issue of administrative detention where there is a prisoner on hunger strike will not result in anything. And if it does, its effectiveness will be temporary. So we need to work to stop administrative detention, and we must start taking it seriously around the world in support of the prisoners who announced a boycott of Israeli courts and help them succeed in their step before the protest steps escalate to reach a mass hunger strike. In addition, Palestinians have lived through horrible situations daily. This not only includes administrative detention, this includes imprisonment and includes killings and torture by the Israeli army and settlers. In conclusion, we as people across the globe, in the diaspora, in other countries, we must put pressure on our governments, on our institutions, in order to show solidarity with the Palestinian people, to put pressure upon the Israeli government.
Thank you so much, Shada, for that deep analysis on the international law element and how what Israel is doing is a violation of it. Clearly, Israel does not use administrative detention as a preventative measure, uses it as a punitive measure, and it uses it in a sweeping fashion. There's been at least 100 detainees every single year since 2002, and that number has gone into the thousands. And as you mentioned earlier, there's 500 detainees currently. And I want to bring it back home here to the United States for a minute, because from this country's we refer to it as very divisive politics, and we're divided: liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. And interestingly enough, on the so-called liberal side, you have this outcry against administrative detention, for example, in Guantanamo Bay, that it does not represent American values. It contradicts our core values. It contradicts our beliefs in democracy, freedom, rule of law, etc. But this system has been in place in Israel for decades. And this system is targeting Palestinians in a sweeping fashion. And I just want to give us a little bit of context here to show the hypocrisy of our political discourse and our media discourse that emphasize and highlight their moral values when it comes to administrative detention when it's done by the United States in Guantanamo Bay. But our so-called greatest ally employs this measure on a daily basis throughout all of Palestine. And you get very, very little noise in Congress. But I did want to point out one Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib, who did tweet about the Hisham's case. She wrote, Hisham Abu Hawash, married, father of 5, held without a scrap of evidence, trial, or even a court hearing in violation of international law since October 2020, on hunger strike for 140 plus days. The government of Israel alone is responsible for the situation and his health and safety, and called on Secretary of State Antony Blinken to demand an end to Israel's practice of holding Palestinians living under apartheid in detention without representation. So we have some noise here that's growing, but unfortunately it's not enough, and we need to push a little bit further. I want you to speak to the fact that the Palestinian cause has gained traction, especially in the West, over the last decade or so. I would say the last, maybe 8 to 10 years or so. Now in the United States, you can use terms like apartheid to refer to what Israel is doing. You can point to the human rights abuses that Israel commits against Palestinians. Yamna, in your writing and in your research, over I don't know how long you've been doing this, but have you seen that shift? And can you speak to that shift? And do you think that shift will get to a point where administrative detentions will no longer be as this extreme form of repression against the Palestinians, and we can push towards this liberation agenda for the Palestinian people?
I do hope that that's possible. I think it is possible, like as you mentioned, that we one day will move away from just talking about, ending the occupation and speaking about Palestine and the larger, framework of liberation. And I do hope, and I do think it's possible to achieve that, and eventually do away with all of these harmful policies that Israel uses against Palestinians, one of which is administrative detention. But it is going to take a lot of work and effort from the international community. And as you said, there has been a significant growth, I think, in Palestinian solidarity worldwide, and at least people's ability to express their solidarity publicly. I've seen it over the past 6 years since I've been reporting on Palestine. I've also seen it just in my own personal experiences. I mean, when I was a student at NYU, I remember it was, Palestinian student groups and student groups who, supported Palestinian rights were often targeted by Zionist groups on and off campus and by the university itself. And it's just total worlds of difference of what we're seeing now in terms of solidarity worldwide, and also, pro-Palestine action and activism on university campuses across the US. So there has been a shift. We saw the result of, I think, that slow and steady shift this past May, during Israel's latest offensive on Gaza and everything that was happening with the uprisings in Jerusalem. And across Palestine, we saw unprecedented levels of global solidarity and people taking to the streets. I do think that that goal of liberation and ending Israeli occupation, apartheid, colonialism, etc., in Palestine is possible. But it is going to take significant efforts, not just from individuals and people and collectives and groups, but also from world leaders, to assume their responsibility under international law to hold Israel accountable for its crimes, which, as Shada detailed, are very clear under international law. And there should be a clear and collective response to those crimes, as we saw, with the fall of the South African regime and other regimes of its sort around the world. It takes extreme measures from global leaders and the global community to hold these powers accountable in order for these violations and these crimes to end.
Thank you so much for that, Yamna. Sikandar, if you can translate the question for Shada, and so she can respond.
Can you shorten the question then?
Okay. We can frame it this way. Considering the shift toward recognizing and accepting and embracing the rights of the Palestinian people, especially in the West, what can we do to push that shift forward, pretty much?
إنه صار في عنا تضامن أكثر للشعب الفلسطيني، إنه كيف ممكن أن نشتغل أكثر، أن نعمل أكثر، أن نعمر أكثر للشعب، وكيف ممكن نضامن أكثر للقضية الفلسطينية.
تمام، يعني بداية مطلوب من إحنا نراكم على كافة الجهود الفلسطينية والدولية اللي تم فعلها بالسنوات الماضية لدعم القضية الفلسطينية، البناء على هاي الجهود جميعها لنوصل اليوم لنتيجة، والبناء على كمان جهود اللي بتطالب بمقاطعة إسرائيل وفرض المقاطعة فعليا على إسرائيل على مختلف المناحي سياسيا واقتصاديا وثقافيا. وهذا أمر كثير يعني صار عندنا كثير ضروري وكثير ملح اليوم، وسط تصاعد يعني الانتهاكات اللي بتمارسها إسرائيل تجاهنا كشعب فلسطيني. اليوم كمان مطلوب من إحنا الضغط على وسائل الإعلام وخاصة الدولية اللي بتشوه الحقيقة وبتشوه وبتحجب اللي بيصير بفلسطين. اليوم مطلوب من إحنا نضغط على وسائل الإعلام لا تعتمد أجندات جديدة مناصرة للشعب الفلسطيني، واللي هو القادر على فعل هاي الضغوطات، حركات مساندة الشعب الفلسطيني بالخارج بفرضها يعني مقاطعة وعقوبات على كافة المؤسسات أو الإعلام اللي بيحاول يحارب القضية الفلسطينية ويحاول يشيطن الشعب الفلسطيني، وهي يعني عملية مستمرة من سنوات طويلة. وإحنا اليوم كمان يعني بنقطف يعني ثمر يعني يعني هذا يعني دائما يعني الحشد ضد الشعب الفلسطيني والقضية الفلسطينية واللي بتقوم فيه كمان الدول الغربية وخاصة أمريكا كمان من مناصرة لإسرائيل رغم كافة الانتهاكات اللي بتمارسها. فاليوم إحنا مطلوب من إحنا ومطلوب من العالم في الخارج دعم حركة المقاطعة وكمان تشبيك مع شعوب العالم وجعلهن أقرب للقضية الفلسطينية. الشعوب تناصر بعضها وهي قادرة على إحداث التغيير وقادرة على الضغط على حكوماتها لإحداث تغيير اتجاه القضية الفلسطينية بشكل خاص. فاليوم الشعوب قادرة على هذا الفعل، وكان عندنا كمان إحنا نماذج عديدة في العالم على الشعوب اللي انتزعت حريتها وكمان اللي قدرت تضغط على حكوماتها وتسقط حكوماتها الفاسدة. فاليوم يعني الأمل متعلق بشعوب العالم اللي قادرة على نصرة القضية الفلسطينية وتحريكها في العالم بشكل كبير وأن يكون في نتيجة ملموسة نحسها اليوم.
Okay, so the boycott of Israel and the international support, which has been continuously growing over the years, has been extremely important and useful, particularly the boycott politically, culturally, and socially. And there also must be more pressure from the media internationally to show the real face of Israel and its policies and what is being done to Palestinians. And it is also necessary for those in the international community to fight and support the Palestinian cause via social media and continue to spread awareness. Palestinians ask Western countries and those around the world to continue participating in the boycott and also pressure the governments, particularly the United States, which is an ally of the Zionist state, to cease their support and put pressure upon the Israeli government to cease these human rights violations. In conclusion, this hope that we have is tied completely to the support of the international community.
Yeah, and I, as we wind this down and we conclude this, I really want the audience to take note of the fact that Hisham is one case, and I know we mentioned this various times here. He's one case of many. There are still, and Shada mentioned this, and I believe Yamna did as well, 500 administrative detainees, not to mention other prisoners. There's currently 500 administrative detainees. There's administrative detainees under the age of 18. And just so we understand the mechanism, and I really want to emphasize the mechanism that's in place to show you how dire it is, and just imagine if you were put in that type of situation where you did not know how to respond to the claims against you because the evidence is secret, where you have an attorney representing you who's not privy to the evidence as well, and they have to challenge something based on nothing, and where and you can come away with the conclusion that there is no evidence, and that's why they're calling it secret evidence, because there's little that they can show. These are political prisoners who are living under a settler-colonial regime. And so the purpose behind these measures is to collectively punish the Palestinian people and to repress any type of resistance against Israel's brutal military occupation. And just to give it even broader context here, I know the main source of these types of administrative detentions happen on the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem. But Israel has a set of laws that applies throughout all of historic Palestine. So there's a specific law regarding administrative detention that applies to what is the internationally recognized borders of Israel. There's a specific law that applies vis-a-vis that is being applied vis-a-vis Gaza, and there's a law that is being applied in the West Bank. So, and they all operate in different ways, but affect the entire Palestinian polity. So this is what I really want the audience to take away from this, is that you're talking about in a regime that is devoted to maintaining racial domination, that is to maintain Jewish supremacy of the state against the indigenous Palestinian population. So this is a way to quell any type of resistance to that type of ideological framework. So that's really what I wanted to lay out before we conclude here and finish with some concluding remarks. But just earlier this week, just to show you what Palestinians go through on a daily basis and how this is just one example of many. Earlier this week, Israeli forces in the West Bank village of Jaljilia, I believe, stopped 80-year-old Palestinian American Omar Abdul Majid as he was driving home after visiting family in his village. And according to this report, he was dragged out of his car. He was beaten by Israeli troops until he was unconscious and left on the ground to die, apparently, of a heart attack. So we will not stand idle as this case is dismissed through an investigation conducted by the same military that arrested, assaulted, and ultimately murdered Omar. Omar and his family deserve justice, and we must come together to help the family receive it, and a host of other families too that are experiencing injustice under the hands of the Israeli apartheid regime. So, this is the daily life of the Palestinian people. And I know, me being here in the diaspora, me living in the West, I have certain privileges that my brothers and sisters do not experience in Palestine. But I do have family in Palestine, and I do have family that live in Jerusalem, and I have family that live in Ramallah. I have family that live throughout Palestine that experience this, and their homes could be demolished next. There could be a Palestinian member of my family that could be administratively detained. So I have a personal interest, but also political interest in this, and this is important for us as Americans here. Now I'm speaking to the American public. It's important for us to understand that we have a stake in this. Our tax dollars go to fund this. One of the key pieces of legislation that exists right now, or bills that hopefully one day will become law, is HR 2590. And it calls for Israel to end its inhumane treatment of Palestinian children, an end to further annexation of Palestinian lands, and an end to home demolitions of Palestinian families. These are simple, basic demands that we ask for here in the United States. So when we speak to the American people, we want them to understand that this is a cry for justice. This is a cry for justice, and we are contributing toward that injustice. And people like Yamna and Shada, who are on the ground, who are studying this and giving us this information and giving us context that we so desperately need here in the United States, we thank them and we honor them, and we thank them for their presence and their contribution to this webinar. And before we conclude and before we end this, I would like each of them to take a minute to kind of just give us some concluding remarks, some hope for the future and what we can look for, and any other messaging that they would like to send out. Yamna, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Shada. And Sikander, if you can let her translate for me. Thank you. Fadali, Yamna. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Everything. I just like to, I don't want to reiterate everything that you just said, but you made some really great points, that at the end of the day, all Americans, at least, and I would think that all global citizens have a stake in Israel's apartheid regime and the occupation of the Palestinian people and the ongoing crimes and violations that are happening every day. I mean, not only do our tax dollars literally pay for Israel's crimes, but also our silence as individuals and as a country and as a global community also contribute to the ongoing violations against Palestinians. So it's really important that people continue to speak up, people continue to raise awareness, people continue to do what they can to support the Palestinian fight for liberation, no matter where they are, whether it's, as Shada mentioned, participating in the BDS movement, participating in boycotts on a local, individual or collective level. There's lots of things that we can do. And I think that the trend that we've witnessed over the past 10 years, as you mentioned, of growing Palestinian solidarity, I think that's going to continue to grow. It's not going to be an easy fight, but at the end of the day, I think we will be successful as long as people continue to advocate for Palestinian rights.
Okay. شذا أي شيء بدك تقولي للجماهير ولأملنا لمستقبل لفلسطين الحرة؟
تمام، يعني أنا من تجربتي كصحفية فلسطينية واحتكاكي الدائم مع الناس في الميدان، دائمًا في نداءات للشعوب حول العالم لمناصرة فلسطين، لأن إحنا كشعب تحت الاستعمار بؤمن أن قضية الفلسطين مش قضية الفلسطينيين، هي قضية العدالة والحرية لكل الشعوب حول العالم. ولذلك الشعب الفلسطيني دائمًا بيآمن أن تحرير فلسطين بيكون كمان عبر الشعوب بالعالم، عبر انتزاعها حرياتها، وعبر كمان مساندتها إلنا كفلسطينيين بانتزاعنا لحريتنا من الاستعمار الإسرائيلي. بالتالي هاي الرسائل اللي دائمًا إحنا بنسمعها من أهالي الشهدا، من أهالي الأسرى، من الناس اللي بيقاوموا في الميدان، اللي هن بيؤمنوا بشعوب العالم أنها هي اللي قادرة لتغير الواقع اللي مفروض علينا اليوم، واللي بتتواطأ فيه حكومات العالم بمساندتها لإسرائيل باستمرار قتلنا وانتهاك حقوقنا وهدم منازلنا ومصادرة أراضينا. فهي رسالة أنا بنقلها على لسان كل الفلسطينيين لكل شعوب العالم، أن اليوم إحنا شعب تحت استعمار، إحنا من حقنا نقاوم الاستعمار رغم كل حالات الشيطنة اللي بتتعرض لها المقاومة الفلسطينية في العالم، ولكن هو حق إلنا كشعب فلسطيني مثل حق لكل الشعوب اللي خضعت للاستعمار واللي تحررت بفعل مقاومتها. وكمان رسالة ثانية أن إحنا تحررنا رح يكون من خلالكم، من خلال أنتوا كشعوب قادرين على الضغط على حكوماتكم، انتزاع حريتكم وصولا لانتزاع حقنا في فلسطين وانتزاع حريتنا ونصرة قضيتنا الفلسطينية. شكرا.
As a Palestinian journalist and as a people living under colonization occupation for so long, the Palestinian cause is a cause of justice for all peoples globally. The Palestinian people believe that the freedom of Palestine not only represents the freedom of Palestine, but also the freedom of all peoples around the globe struggling against violent occupation and oppression. The families of those martyred, the families of prisoners and protesters, they all equally believe that only the people can change the reality on the ground. Israel continually humiliates and tortures and kills our people. And this, as a message from the Palestinian people, we are revolting against the occupation and the colonial power for our rights and for the rights of all occupied people around the globe, so that we continue to put pressure upon upon the governments abroad for the freedom and victory of the Palestinian people and cause.
Oh, what a powerful statement to end on by the both of you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for providing us with your expertise and laying out the context of Hisham's case and administrative detention generally, and also what the Palestinians are going through and how we should always press forward and to push for a liberation agenda and to never give up. The trend is moving in the right direction, and I think that we can capture this moment, and the future belongs to us. And the first Prime Minister of Israel said that the old will die and the young will forget. Well, we have We have the young in front of us right now, and they did not forget, and they'll never forget, and the future generation will not forget as well. Let's push forward and inshallah achieve a free Palestine. Thank you all. Thank you for the audience for joining in. Thank you again. Assalamu alaikum.